Well, well, well. Here we are again. Here you are. Here I am. Here we go. Reading 51, Chapter 2 of The Demon in the Embers. I realise, having looked at yesterday's video, that the cracked phone has this slightly misty quality. It's kind of nice in a way. Slightly misty quality to it. The new one, at 2 o'clock, I got a text saying, "Good news! Your phone is 8 minutes away. The delivery driver is called David." And then about 6 minutes after that, I had a "Good news! Your phone has been dispatched." I thought, okay. And then, "Good news! Your phone will be delivered before 3:38. I'm thinking, right, okay. "Good news! Your phone will be delivered between 2 and 4. Okay, so we're missing. They've missed every single one of their targets. About 3 minutes ago, I had another one. "Good news!" Hallelujah. Phone's 10 minutes away. Well, yeah. You know what? I'll believe it when I see it. But at least it works. At least it works. And it's sort of slightly soft focus. So, yeah, it just sort of eases around the edges. So, yes, here we are again. Another day, another chapter. Another day of homeschooling. I wonder how many of the people who watch this will have been back to school today. Of course, most of my readers, the majority, are in between years 3 and 6, and of course years 3, 4 and 5 couldn't go back. My son in year 4 was so put out about it, so upset about it. He was desperate to go back. And my son in year 6 didn't mind one way or the other, and actually we've kept him home because year 4 can't go back, so we're not sending year 6 or year 1 back either. So we're just carrying on, you know. We've been doing this, what was this, week 8, I think? Week 8 of homeschooling. So, you know, we're just going to carry on. Anyway, chapter 2. Joe has arrived in London. In some time in the past, he hasn't worked out quite what. Big hats with big curled up brims, and he's just been rescued by a couple of really unpleasant, rough types, by a man in sort of gentleman's clothing in a long wig, curly, or rather he doesn't know it's a wig, but long curly hair. If you've seen pictures of Prince Charles II, you would recognise it. So yeah, this is what it looks like. He hasn't worked out yet what date it is. You may have some clue, even though the front cover's mirror image. You probably might have some idea what date it might be, but he doesn't know. And this gentleman has rescued him from these people who were trying to kidnap him effectively to send him off on the ships. Sometimes we talk about press ganging people, or people being press ganged. At the time this book is set, they talked about pressing men. It's the same thing. It basically means kidnapping somebody and making them go to fight for you. So Joe's decided he's going to go with the man. He doesn't really know who he is, although the man does have a son called Peter who's 13. And so Joe is hoping very much that this might turn out to be Lucy's family. Chapter 2. The man strode swiftly back up the street. He carried a walking cane, but it seemed to be for style, not support, even though his shoes had high heels, Joe noticed, which were surely difficult to walk on over the cobbles. Joe hurried along beside him, glad that his heels weren't high like that. Although the man seemed kind, Joe felt anxious. Every other time he'd arrived in a new world, Lucy had been the first person he saw, or at least the first he'd spoken to. He hadn't realised how much he relied on meeting her straight away. But this time he hadn't found her, and now he'd agreed to go with a stranger, somebody he hoped was her father, but who might very well not be. He thought how many times he'd been told not to talk to strangers, never to go with a stranger. His stomach knotted up. He'd gone against all the warnings. Yet, what was the alternative? He couldn't very well just wander around in this foreign London, hoping to run into Lucy. It was clear that he didn't have a clue what dangers might lurk here, since he'd had to be rescued already. It was foolish to hope that the one person he knew from the past would suddenly appear. There must be thousands of people living here, even tens or hundreds of thousands. He had no idea how big this city was, but he could see how unlikely it was that he would find Lucy, even if she was here somewhere. What if she wasn't? It was a sudden, terrible thought. What if she didn't exist here at all? He'd taken it for granted that this was her latest world, but why shouldn't there be worlds in the past that didn't include her? Despite the heat, Joe shivered. All he could do was go with the man and hope for the best. It wasn't much of a plan, but he didn't have a better one. As they walked, they kept to the side of the road as much as possible, beneath the overhanging buildings. There were empty baskets on the ground outside many of the houses, and more than once Joe nearly tripped. Most other people were trying to keep to the sides too, since the middle of the street was busy with horses and carriages and carts that came dangerously close to colliding when they passed each other. Even when the road was clear, the centre of it was strewn with all kinds of rubbish, including bits of vegetables, sawdust, straw and ash, and of course endless horse dung. Here and there puddles of water trickled away through broken paving or into a gully that ran down the middle of the road, though this was mostly blocked. Joe was just wondering where the water had come from, since it wasn't raining, when there was a shout from above. His companion stopped dead. Joe stopped too. From a window 2 stories up, liquid sluiced down, splattering the middle of the street just ahead of them. Joe looked up in time to see a woman turning a large china potty the right way up. These puddles weren't water, they were wee. It was no wonder the place stank. Joe wondered whether they did this with poo as well. He hadn't noticed any, but decided to be more careful where he put his feet. Further along, the man turned right into a narrower street and then left at the end. Joe had tried to keep track of the way they'd come, but he had no real sense of where they were, except that the Tower of London must be somewhere behind them, and the river too, perhaps. He hoped it didn't matter. If this man was Lucy's father, in a short time he would see Lucy again and be able to explore this new London with her. He knew from experience that the place would quickly start to feel more familiar with her at his side. Then another terrible thought occurred to him. Even if this man was William Lucas, he'd said that 4 of his children had died of plague. What if Lucy had been one of them? He'd mentioned a daughter, but that could perfectly well have been one of her sisters. There was no reason why Lucy should have survived rather than Anne or Cecily. Joe's stomach clenched even more tightly. He didn't want to be here without her. Before he could think any further about it, however, he was distracted by a peculiar sound ahead. It wasn't quite like anything he'd heard before, even back at home. A sort of chuckling and whistling of many voices, gentle rather than shrill, but still loud in the narrow street. There was a strong smell, too, that reminded Joe of a farmyard. "Oh dear," the man said, as they came to a halt behind a gathering crowd. "If he's hoping to get a good price for those, he's going to be disappointed." Joe craned his neck to see what his companion was talking about. Beyond the people in front of them, the whole width of the street was filled by a soft blanket of greyish-brown and black at about the height of Joe's thigh. It stretched right along the road as far as he could see, and was moving slowly forward, undulating as it went. It dawned on Joe that the forest of pink stalks sticking out of it were necks and heads. Even so, he still wasn't sure what he was looking at. "Trade over at Newgate will have dropped off by now," the man said. "The white market does most of its business between 5 and about 8. It's nearly noon already, and he's got the whole city to get across. He'll be better off warehousing them till Saturday if he can, though he must have about 1,000 birds there." Joe was still puzzled. Unfortunately, they're not the most intelligent creatures, turkeys. If you try to hurry them, they get in a flap and it takes even longer. Turkeys? Joe grinned. No wonder he hadn't recognised them. Who would expect to see 1,000 turkeys on a London street? Where have they come from? He asked tentatively. Did you not see them on your way into London? They're usually driven in from Norfolk and Suffolk. By cart? Joe asked. The man burst out laughing. No, on their own 2 feet, like they are now. Rearing turkeys doesn't make a man rich. Joe blushed. If the farmer's doing well, he might have shod them, the man added more gently. They probably walk better in shoes. Shoes, Joe echoed before he could stop himself. Well, not quite shoes, that's geese. They have shoes to walk to market. The turkeys' feet are dipped in tar and sand, I think. Come on, it'll take us all day if we stay behind them. We'll turn back and go up Lime Street. Joe followed the man back through the big crowd that had now built up behind them. In a way, it was a bit like Jorvik on the day of the ship burial. Another historic traffic jam. The place did remind him a bit of Jorvik, especially the smell, but there was obviously much more wealth here. Almost all of the buildings they'd passed were a lot taller than any of the Jorvik houses had been, and there were diamond-shaped panes of glass in most of the open windows. It was true there were plenty of tumble-down houses that were scarcely better than hovels, but even they mostly had one upstairs floor, and between them were a few much grander dwellings, some of them with stained glass crests in their windows. As they turned left onto another street, a beautiful carriage jolted past, drawn by horses with plumed headdresses. The driver wore ornate livery, but no hat, despite his head being bald. Joe wondered why. Everyone else he'd seen here, from the youngest to the oldest, was wearing some kind of hat or hair covering, and most of the men had hair down to their shoulders, even if it wasn't as nicely curled as his companions. "Here we are," the man said. Joe looked up at the house they'd stopped at. Like so many others, it was built with black beams and white walls, sandwiched between its neighbours. The second and third stories jutted out over the road. Part way up the wall of the second story hung a sign like the sign outside a pub. There were no words on it, no name, just a picture of some kind of exotic bird. Joe wondered what it meant. Perhaps the man kept a shop here, but Joe still couldn't guess from the sign what it might sell. When they stepped inside, however, there was no shop or workshop, just a hallway. Before Joe's eyes could adjust to the gloom, a shape launched itself towards him from the top of a wall hanging. He staggered backwards as it wrapped itself around his face, knocking his hat off. It was warm and furry. Joe grappled with it. A thin, hairy snake coiled around his neck. It was getting tighter. Joe flailed, all fingers and thumbs. He couldn't loosen its grip. It was going to strangle him. "Get off, Solomon," barked the man. "Peter, would you come and get this animal, please? It's too much for our visitors to be leapt on the moment they walk through the door." "He's upstairs," said a girl's voice. "Here, Solomon." At once the creature let go of Joe. He watched it spring onto the shoulder of the fair-haired girl who had come along the passage. It was a monkey, Joe saw, small and quite sweet when you weren't fighting it off. The girl held something between thumb and finger, which the monkey was instantly intent on taking. Joe looked at the girl carefully, hoping to see some resemblance to Lucy. There was none at all. Where Lucy was dark, this girl was blonde. Lucy had been about the same height as him, but this girl was shorter and plumper. Without a doubt, this wasn't his friend. Dread grew inside Joe. It wasn't even Cecily or Anne. A woman appeared in the doorway behind the girl, carrying 2 dishes. Joe watched as she went past into the room on the left. Unlike the girl, she did look vaguely familiar, but she wasn't Lucy's mother. "Solomon will do anything for a cherry," the girl said, smiling. Will he really? The man's eyebrows went up. How about sitting quietly on his stand for an hour without causing havoc? But I only let him off the leash 5 minutes ago when I came in, came a voice from above. He can't stay tied up all day. He has to have some fun. A fair-haired boy a bit older than Joe was coming down the stairs. Joe looked up. Relief flooded his chest. This was Peter. His hair was longer than last time, and he'd grown taller, but Joe was certain it was him. He felt like hugging the other boy. The girl let the monkey have the cherry. At once it skipped onto Peter's shoulder, where it sat, delicately nibbling the flesh of the fruit, stripping it from the stone. The girl turned and went back along the corridor to the room the woman had come from. Joe's mind raced. What had happened to this family? The man had said his son was called Peter, and this was the Peter Joe knew. So in that case the man must be William Lucas after all. But if the girl was his daughter and the woman his wife, had he remarried? He must have done. And that surely meant that Ellen was dead, and so too were Lucy, Cecily and Anne. Joe could hardly bear to think of it. William Lucas picked up Joe's hat from the floor and put it with his own on a side table. Then, to Joe's astonishment, he lifted his hair off. Beneath the wig, his head was stubbly, as though his hair had been shaved off. He placed the wig on a stand, then took an ornately embroidered skull cap from a drawer and put it on. "Just make sure you clear up the poo this time," he said to his son. "Don't disappear back to school pretending you've forgotten again." He turned to Joe. "Solomon is a macaque. I bought him from an Indian trader last time I was in Antwerp to cheer us all up. But he's more trouble than he's worth. He's clearly very, very intelligent." At this the monkey gave an ear-splitting shriek. "But he refuses to do his business in one place." William glared at the monkey. "Sometimes it smells almost as bad in here as it does out on the street. On balance, I think I preferred the sparrow Elizabeth tamed. It used to eat at the table with us, and it didn't make half as much mess." Elizabeth. Joe's mouth formed the name soundlessly. That must be the girl. She must be William Lucas's stepdaughter. He swallowed. William pushed open a door. Joe followed him into a room that was only a little lighter than the hallway. It seemed to be a sort of sitting room, Joe thought, though it wasn't much like his own sitting room at home. There was a rug in the middle of polished floorboards, and a bench stood along one wall. To the side was a small table covered with a carpet, as the side at Old Wardour had been, and around it were 3 chairs with carved legs and tapestry cushions. Facing the window, to catch what little light filtered in through the greyish panes, was an embroidery frame, at which a woman sat working. On the other side of the room from the door, a girl stood with her back to them in front of an elaborately painted rectangular box set on another table. She was playing it like a piano. Music tinkled softly from it. Joe's pulse quickened again. This girl might be Lucy. She was the right height and slender, like his friend had been, but until he saw her face he couldn't be sure. "This is my wife and daughter," William said. The woman and the girl both turned from what they were doing. Joe looked into familiar blue eyes. The tension that had been mounting inside him broke like a dam. He wanted to laugh. It was her. It was Lucy. Thank goodness for that. Impulsively he stepped towards his friend. Her expression stopped him. Joe bowed to cover his embarrassment. Of course, to Lucy he was a stranger. He should know that by now. She never remembered him from one world to the next. So this must be a new world after all, not the family from Old Wardour living in London. For a moment he saw in his mind's eye her face as they'd said goodbye last time. She'd been upset that they wouldn't meet again, and now here he was, yet for her it was all new. Lucy's mother bowed her head, and Lucy courtesied. What? Lucy's mother bowed her head, and Lucy curtsied. The pale grey bodice she wore stopped her from bending, but her red skirt still swept the floor beneath her apron. Dark ringlets of hair crept out at the sides of her white cap. "This is Joseph Hopkins," William said, "and this is Ellen," he gestured to his wife, "and Lucy. And I should have introduced myself. I'm William Lucas." Joe tried not to smile too broadly. How astonished they would be to know that he knew them already. He bowed to Ellen. "Call me Joe, please, madam," he said. "I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. And yours too, Lucy." He beamed at her. The girl smiled shyly, taken aback by the warmth of his greeting. "I was on my way back from the wharf," William said, "when I found two ruffians pressing him for the ships." "But he looks younger than me," Peter objected from the doorway behind them. William nodded. "He is, which means you should take care on your way to and from school. You know there's barely a young man to be seen in the streets, and no watermen. It's almost impossible to get a boat. They're all afraid of being taken. It's a sorry state of affairs." "What were you doing, Joe?" asked Lucy's mother, "before my husband found you?" "I'd only just arrived in London," he answered. "Where from?" Joe thought quickly. William Lucas had said something about plague in the east of the country. "Norwich," he answered, hoping this was reasonable. "His family is dead. Contagion," put in William. Joe lowered his head in a show of sorrow. "Poor thing," murmured Ellen. "You're not carrying it, are you?" Lucy sounded worried. Joe shook his head. "I don't believe so." "Don't be afraid, my love," her father said. "I wouldn't have brought him here if I thought he was. But there's no way he could have walked so far if he was ill. How long did it take you, Joe? 6 days? 7? 7, Joe said, grateful that he hadn't had to guess. "What brought you to London?" Peter asked. "I thought Norwich was quite a big town." Joe turned, thinking how to answer. "I couldn't bear to stay," he improvised. "All our friends and neighbours are being taken ill." The belief in Peter's face encouraged him to continue. "I couldn't watch them die too. I wanted to make a fresh start, away from all the memories." There was a short silence. Then Ellen said, "You must be tired and hungry. We'll have a good dinner shortly. It's actually another fast day here for the plague, but I'm afraid we don't always observe them, so you're in luck." Joe was about to ask why they would fast for the plague, but stopped himself. Maybe it was a way of raising money, like a sponsored famine or something. Ellen slipped her needle into the embroidery she was working on and rose from her chair. "Lucy and I will help Mary and Elizabeth finish getting the dinner on the table. You sit down and rest. Peter and Solomon can keep you entertained." Joe sat down in the chair she indicated. Peter went to the window. At once the monkey sprang up the curtains and stalked along the rail with the poise of a tightrope walker. William followed his wife and daughter out of the room. "Is it fun, having a monkey?" Joe asked Peter. He found he was really glad to see Lucy's closest brother again. It made being here feel much more normal, especially after what he'd feared. "It is, as long as he likes you." Peter grinned. "He can be mean if he doesn't." "How do you know if he likes you?" Joe asked, thinking of the monkey's tail wrapped around his throat. Was it possible to be throttled by an animal so much smaller than you? "Oh, you'd know all right if he didn't. He'd start by pulling your hair and pinching you, then move on to biting. My father has an apprentice who Solomon hates. He's the son of one of my father's distant cousins. The cousin and his wife both died of the plague, so my father took the boy in and arranged for him to be bound to the worshipful company of mercers. But there's no sign of gratitude from him." "Is that why Solomon hates him? Because he's ungrateful?" Joe asked with a smile. Peter laughed. "Maybe. As my father said, he's a very intelligent animal. Or maybe he just senses that Tobias is a rotten apple." The smile froze on Joe's lips. Tobias, he said faintly. That's right, Peter said. In fact, that was him, just passing the window. You'll meet him in a moment. So there we are. The right family, with extra added monkey, who I might say was named by my now 11-year-old son when I wrote this book. My son I think was 8 when I wrote this. Is that right? Something like that. And I asked him, what do you think would be a good name for a monkey? And he said immediately Solomon, which actually I thought was great, because Solomon is a biblical name, and people in this time were much, much more religious than we are now, by and large much more Christian than most people are these days. And so actually Solomon is a perfect name, and that just came out of my son's mouth just like that, without thinking about it. So Joe's got the right family with added monkey, but also with Tobias. There is no getting away from his former enemy, not even for a moment. So there we are. Chapter 2, Chapter 3 tomorrow, Wednesday, 5 o'clock. I hope to see some of you then. And I hope that I will be not sitting in a sort of halo of mist, because I heard the doorbell. So obviously the good news that my delivery driver was only 10 minutes away this time may have proved true, unless it turned out it was something else altogether. I'll see you tomorrow.